the section 1.1b. I was wondering why we did not use FEMA's direct words in that particular paragraph. What we have in the draft is encourage the utilization of appropriate construction practices in order to prevent or minimize flooding damage. But FEMA does have a direct quote, and I typed it in there. I thought perhaps you might consider using FEMA's direct words as opposed to what's here.
Well, we didn't delete anything. What language is in B was what language was in the original ordinance. You're suggesting that FEMA has some additional language?
Yes. No, well, I typed in there, FEMA's direct language is to encourage the utilization of appropriate construction practices in order to avoid long and short-term adverse impacts. And I typed the whole sentence out there.
It's a big difference.
Their entire, but that is their direct, from their own book that Mr. Sneed walked off with. So I was just, I will also want to just point out, you start off the ordinance, the county starts off the ordinance with authority and purpose, but there is no paragraph that addresses the authority that you
I think we
have
should
or the
all sit
purpose.
down and give Joy the same.
So I suggested that you quote the executive orders that grant the county the authority to be doing this. I just thought that was a good, I just suggest that you put that at the front of your ordinance. On page 2 of the ordinance, which I guess would still be section 1.1, the letter F, you have reduced the financial burdens imposed on the residents and its governmental units. I suggest that you insert the phrase real property owners. Not everyone is a resident. You used the word real property owners earlier, you just didn't use it here in this paragraph. So I would suggest that you add it there. I have a real issue with section 2.2a, where you're doing all the definitions. Definition number 2 has to do with adverse effect. And this is new. It wasn't in the original ordinance. So is this FEMA's definition that's included here? Their wording?
I don't know the answer to that.
Mrs. Huff, I can tell you because I think I suggested that language. And as I recall, just so you know, when Mr. Sneed gave a deposition, I think he gave testimony as to FEMA's understanding or what FEMA considered adverse impact, and that was a kind of a 1-foot rule. And that's why we crafted it that way, just so you understand. I mean, that's FEMA's repeatedly said, you know, the 1-foot rule, and that the phrase adverse impact is throughout this ordinance. There needed to be some definition. That's why we suggested it.
Because in the original FEMA ordinance, the words were used. For the example that I come up with is in the approximated zone. There was no, every other zone had a definition that you would compare the effect to some standard. Approximated zone, where a lot of these end up because it's not proper, they're not mapped, didn't have a standard. And when I read the ordinance the first time, I said, well, what's the standard? And only by the fact that all the experts agree that the 1-foot rule applies, did we even come to that understanding generally as litigants.
If that's not in there, then Dan has a bigger problem to consider what adverse impact is.
Well, I disagree. If you're going to be just giving blatant definitions, I just think you need to stick with the legal terms of what adverse means, what impact means, instead of trying to specify a certain degree of elevation or a lack of elevation. I just think you need to define what adverse effect means.
Well, that's what this language tried to do by inserting the 1-foot rule to attach to adversely affect. I thought that's what we were trying to do. Is the red language below paragraph 2 what you're suggesting
Yes.
the language to be?
I would suggest that you would just define adverse effect as any and all flood-related harm that is caused to or will be caused to the subject property or to any and all of the adjacent properties. And that you don't allow a development if it's possible that it's going to be causing an adverse impact. To try to specifically tie it to the 1-year floodplain, 1-foot elevation.
But that's what FEMA says, though.
Well, you're essentially trying to instill within the whole ordinance then a zero-sum game. That is a floodway game.
There are some places in the ordinance where it already says zero gain.
Yeah, in floodway areas.
Right.
Yeah, but there are 4 different areas defined in the ordinance.
I mean, if you look at FEMA's recommended or suggested requirements on this, it is the 1-foot rule. I mean,
But by the definition of a floodway and a floodplain, it's the amount of area that we've already set aside so that the water can spread out and not be any higher than 1 foot. So now if you come in and say we're going to tolerate up to a foot above the elevation, now you're saying that all the property owners have got to tolerate a minimum of 2 feet.
that's not right. It's 1 foot increase in the base flood elevation. So whatever the base flood elevation is, plus a foot. What you're also ignoring is this. If you take out the 1-foot rule, and it goes back to the way the ordinance is drafted,
Yeah.
I can have a 5-foot increase in the base flood elevation in a floodplain in your meadow, which may not result in any harm to anybody's property, which FEMA says, no, that's not acceptable. This is a more restrictive, the 1-foot rule is more restrictive than what was previously drafted.
Yeah.
And we suggested that. It is, in our litigation between this man, with all due respect, the 1-foot rule helps you more than the language that was in the prior ordinance.
I understand that.
And so, because harm to property, I mean, it may not hit Mr. Foster's home, a 2-foot increase in the base flood elevation may not hit Mr. Foster's home. It may just hit the house. And so harm to property, if there's water on properties that harm, that's a whole different ballgame. That's why the FEMA suggests a 1-foot rule. I think it used to be 2 foot. Is that what they told us, Don? And then it went to 1 foot? It used to be a 2-foot rule.
But they have no problems with you if you wish to say it will not increase the base flood elevation any higher than it already is, right?
In floodplains, they recommend that there can be a 1-foot rise in the base flood elevation. So FEMA is saying in flood approximated zone A, there can be a 1-foot rise in base flood elevation.
But FEMA also says we can make the rules
More stringent.
More stringent.
More stringent.
Yes, we don't have
They
to
didn't
stick
say
to
that.
that
It's
one.
red.
That is correct, and that would be a decision that this county commission could make.
Because I realize what you're saying is, in your mind, quite logical, Mr. Hastings, but the water is already up to the sill of my front door when it floods. So now if I have to tolerate another foot, then it's in my house.
Well, you're also, don't confuse a rise in the water of a foot versus a rise in the base flood elevation. Just because the base flood elevation rises doesn't mean that the water levels will rise a foot. It does not mean that. I mean, if you look at your expert's area of inundation, which suggested, I believe, it was a 2.6 foot rise in the base flood elevation right in front of the pad, as I recall, the water did not hit your house. So just because there's a rise in the base flood elevation doesn't mean the water rises the same.
No, I disagree with that. I don't know how to argue with you about that because that's not my forte, but I disagree because every time that meadow floods, it's up on the porch.
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is an increase in the base flood elevation may not necessarily make that water higher than that. It's not necessarily the case.
Where's it going to go then? Where's the water going to
Yeah,
go?
where is
Just
it
build
going?
up
It doesn't
there.
mean that
If you, let me ask a simple question. If you put 64,000 cubic yards of dirt in a floodplain, and you tell me that it does not increase the base flood elevation?
I didn't say that. What, no,
I believe that's what we were interpreting you to say.
I didn't say that, because our own floodplain study said it did increase the base flood elevation to a certain level. What I'm saying is, if you put 3 feet of fill in the floodplain, it doesn't mean the water's going to raise 3 feet, is what I'm saying. And I'm not an engineer. I'm just
Where's
an
the water
engineer.
going then?
I don't know, but both our engineer and Mrs. Huff engineer were consistent that it didn't raise the same level. Isn't that right, Don?
Yeah, that is correct.
I mean, I'm not an engineer. I'm a lawyer. I'm just telling you, the engineers will tell you that if you have 3 feet of dirt, that doesn't mean the water's going to rise up 3 feet.
That's correct. I mean, it all depends on the.
But where's the water gonna go?
It flows. What happens is the water, more water is going to flow faster, so it's not going to build up.
There's no place for it to flow.
It flows down. I told you I don't know, I'm not an engineer. I'm just telling you the engineers testified to that, okay?
Okay, well, I just leave the commission and those writing the ordinance with the option that was mentioned. We can use FEMA standards, but there is nothing that prevents us from being more restrictive, correct?
Correct.
If we choose to say the development will be a 0 increase in base flood elevation, there is no legal reason why we cannot say that. Is that correct?
If your county commission adopts that.
But
If the county, right.
that is a tricky, and I will just add, since we're on that issue, that is a tricky game, because it's not just oil and gas industry we're talking about. So if anybody wants to do anything in the floodplain, any activity is going to make.
And I'm not I know you don't believe that, but I'm not directing this strictly at the oil and gas industry.
I understand that, but I appreciate that, and that's fine, and I'm not suggesting you necessarily are. What I just want the commission to be aware of when they're considering this is that will have a major impact on anybody doing anything that lives in floodplain. You couldn't stack hay up across the floodplain, because that would increase it, because water is not going to flow straight through the hay. I know I'm talking about hay and people are laughing, but that's the reality of it all.
You build a parking lot and put a mobile home unit or a mattress sale business with a big, huge parking lot. There's no place for the water to go anymore. It can't soak into the ground. And so we're going to get affected by it, and I'm not sure we can tolerate it.
Well, if you want, you could suggest to your county commission that there be no development in the floodplain.
That's what we And they have the power to do it.
They don't want to pay much for permits, they don't want to.
And
Why do we need it? This is our.
If I may make a comment, okay? What we're dealing with here, and Mr. Hastings has spent a good part of his evening regarding his salary, shifting to how this is going to harm us if we want to put up a shed, or have a hay bale, or a haystack, or whatever. What we need to think about is this is not your conventional drilling. The playing field has changed, the rules need to change. Because this is 7 to 8 acres of a person's land, not what they do with a conventional well. And I think you guys hopefully have gotten a lot more familiar with the difference between a conventional well and a Marcellus well. And the obligation here is to look at it and say, maybe what's in the books is not good enough now, and we need to make it better. And that's not happening when you have somebody breathing down your neck, threatening to sue, and we're going to follow this suit. We follow an injunction, and we do that now because they figure the citizens don't have any way to do the same thing. But what we do have is a way to vote and to make sure that we vote for people that will protect us. And that doesn't mean that we're saying they can't drill, but there's nothing wrong with saying that find someplace else. If it's in a floodplain, maybe you can't drill there. Maybe your mineral rights will not let you go in that section of your property plat that you own the minerals on. And that's what this is all about, really. It's protecting us because these are huge well pads. These are not just your little conventional wells. These are going to, and all the things that go on, we're seeing pictures of tank farms that are floating downstream because they're put right on the edge of a stream, and those epic 360 reserve pits that they put right up against streams. You get a flood, the water rises, it rises too high, and it mixes with those chemicals. And these are things that have to be considered that maybe this kind of development, if it's industry, if it's oil and gas, maybe it's going to cause more harm in a floodplain than somebody's little old barn or shack or haystack.
This is our home.
Okay.
That's right. We have rights to people have.
I think throughout the night you've made your point on this issue. I mean, really. Ms. Huff,
They had plenty of time to make theirs.
Ms. Huff has the floor, I think.
Right.
Another
You're
thing.
welcome.
I'm changes, sir, because they're just typos that I thought you might want to be aware of?
Well, as I've said to everyone, if you find a misspelling or a typographical error, please bring it to my attention so that we get it corrected. My eyes have, it's very hard to read a document so many times and pick up those types of things.
On page 8, the item, I'm sorry, I don't know what section I'm in, but it's item number 23, and it's on page 8 of the ordinance, and it's your definition of interested person or party. And by the definition that's in here, it says to include the applicant, the owner of the subject party, a resident on the property.
Well, we've addressed this. This is our expanded definition, and believe me, we did intend to exclude Mr. Foster from the definition. I mean, to personalize it, it's inappropriate, but we are expanding the definition.
Okay.
And I think we're going to meet your desires there.
Okay. Then on page 12, I guess I can't discuss that because Mr. Sneed said that this has to be according to FEMA wording, right?
Joy, if I may interject, I know how that feels. Go ahead.
What? Oh, not being able to discuss something because FEMA. Leave it to Kevin to be able to tell us both to be quiet. I would suggest, because someone mentioned alternative locations, on page 16, top of page 16, I would like to suggest that when it comes to applicant demonstrate that there are no reasonable alternatives other than the floodway encroachment before a permit is issued, I would suggest an additional sentence. The lack of an alternative location does not automatically guarantee the applicant will be granted a permit. The implication here is that all they have to do is show that there are no reasonable alternatives. But just because there are no reasonable alternatives don't mean that you get to be given the candy jar. So I would respectfully request that you consider adding that sentence.
As brief response to that, because I don't want to have to get up later, one sentence. Again, comply with the technical requirements of the ordinance, you should get the floodplain permit. If you don't, you shouldn't. So I don't know if you want to add that or not. That's something you can consider. But it shouldn't matter either way, because if you comply, it doesn't matter if there's a reasonable alternative location. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
I would also like to suggest that you add item number 4, which you do not have in the ordinance. I would like to suggest if we cannot keep certain activities out of the floodplain, then we at least add some greater restrictive items. For instance, I think all the drilling sites need to be 100 feet minimum from the floodplain. And I think they need to be 1,000 feet from our public water. And I don't think we should allow them anywhere around some of our major tributaries like Middle Island or
Buckeye.
there ought to be certain tributaries within our county that become sacred, and we have to be able to say, no, you don't go around these tributaries.
If I may just briefly respond, because I don't want to come back to the end, and I apologize. That is an equal protection issue that could rise to another constitutional issue. You can't just pick and choose where it is. If you comply with technical requirements, you get it. Some of the things you suggested are within the purview of the DEP and outside your authority to enact this floodplain ordinance. Sorry.
But actually, some of the stuff that Ms. Huff is mentioning, there are designated at-risk creeks and waterways in Doddridge County that are being watched or theoretically protected by the DNR.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is, if that's the case, that's the DNR jurisdiction. That's not the floodplain. That's not the Doddridge County Commission jurisdiction. If there are those restrictions, that's fine. What I'm telling you, that is not their role in enacting the floodplain ordinance.
Do you have to get a permit from the DNR?
I'm not saying that. What I'm telling you is if there are restrictions, that's in someone else's jurisdiction, not this one. That's just my responsive comment. I mean, that's all. I don't want to debate it, that's just my responsive comment. Go ahead.
When, also on page 16, I don't see why we cannot request when they're dealing with a zone AE or any other zone where the floodway has not been delineated. Before any entity, I don't care whether it's oil and gas or somebody wanting to put in a huge parking lot or a barn or a restaurant that's going to take up 3 acres or more, they should be required to delineate where that floodway is so that we can get our maps revamped. We have a great many of our floodplain maps are out of date. And perhaps this is one way that we can start getting them brought up to date. If we're going to allow any kind of activity that's going to take up a massive amount of acreage in a floodplain where the floodway has not been delineated, then surely we have the right to require that that floodway be delineated before we grant a permit. So that's
Again,